Prepare to plunge into a heart-pounding fight for survival, where crystalline invaders warp reality itself and an unlikely alliance might be the only hope. In this story, a lone bunker dweller named Micah Dorn risks everything to rescue a mysterious alien mother and her young son. Little does he know, their struggle will ignite an all-out war against the spectrals, relentless beings capable of reshaping matter at will. From desperate standoffs in scorched deserts to the ultimate confrontation inside a legendary vault, the stakes soar higher with each page. Curious how it all ends? You won't want to miss a single moment of the twists, revelations, and heartbreak. Subscribe to our channel now to stay updated on this and other thrilling stories, and buckle up for a sci-fi saga that pits courage, hope, and sacrifice against an enemy that knows no limits. Stick around. Your support helps us create even more epic adventures, and we can't wait to share them all with you. Micah Dorn first noticed the flickering alert on a dim evening, the Nevada desert sky ablaze with the last hues of twilight. He was hunched over a workstation in his bunker's control room, dust motes drifting lazily through beams of artificial light. 5 years he had lived in solitude under the desert's cracked surface, his only companions a rotating stable of drones and an advanced AI security system that supervised the perimeter. This day, however, broke the silent pattern. A shrill proximity alarm cut through the hush, pulling Micah's attention to a holographic monitor on his left. He squinted at the readouts, blinking once to be sure he was seeing them correctly. Some large object had tripped the motion sensors that encircled his fortress, a perimeter he had configured to detect anything bigger than a tumbleweed within a 2-mile radius. "Show me Sector 12, he commanded, voice resonating with an authority he had all but forgotten. In the lower right corner of his main display, he caught a swirl of color streaking across the dusky horizon. The dusty orange of twilight was being pierced by a flash of radiant turquoise, trailing a tail of molten fire as it descended. At first, he assumed it might be a meteorite, a rare but not impossible event out here, away from city lights and the usual bustle of civilization. However, the shape on the monitor was sleek, elongated, and disturbingly controlled in its descent. It was no mere chunk of rock. Micah's breath hitched. Years ago, he had witnessed something like this when the first Seraph vessels visited Earth. Seraph technology was renowned for its elegant lines and luminous plasma emissions, but this craft's approach was anything but graceful. The feed showed the craft lurching unnaturally, chunks of bright metal ripping away and spiraling behind it. It was bleeding energy from catastrophic hull breaches, each rupture bleeding sparks and trails of multi-hued residue into the air. His sensors struggled to lock onto a single stable pattern. The craft's energy signature fluctuated as if reality itself were unraveling around it. Then he saw it, a strange distortion chasing the falling ship, a mosaic of crystalline geometry suspended in midair. Even without clearer data, he recognized the phenomenon from old reports and personal nightmares. The spectrals. These were the entities that had laid waste to entire facilities across the globe years ago, devouring matter and rewriting it into their perfect, unnatural forms. The nightmares he carried revolved around that same threat. His heart thundered in his chest. If the spectrals had returned, then his quiet 5-year exile was about to be shattered in ways he wanted desperately to avoid. Micah pressed a series of tactile icons on the control panel, sending out a wave of scanning drones. Their small engines hummed to life in the topmost level of the bunker before they zoomed away into the evening desert, each dispatching streams of raw data back to him. The falling craft glowed on his screens, a distorted silhouette near the point of impact. If it belonged to Seraph travelers, there might be survivors, and in turn, those survivors might need his help. Yet a voice in the back of his head urged him to remain hidden, to seal the bunker's heavy doors and ignore this cosmic intrusion. He had pledged never to intervene in battles too large for him to shape again. The cost had been too high last time. But then, an audio feed crackled through his emergency frequency, one that was supposed to be restricted. "We're going down," a desperate voice called, feminine and trembling. "If anyone hears us, help, my son, please." Micah flinched, a child. Of all the possibilities, that was the one he dreaded, the one that would unravel his vow of inaction. Gritting his teeth, he flicked through the bunker's readiness systems. His security suite engaged with a hum, a personal combat exosuit, shield generators, an old plasma rifle he had refurbished more times than he could count. He stared at the feed in mute resignation. Even if he tried to tune out that call for help, he knew he would fail. A child's cry was a universal plea. It transcended faction, species, and ideology. In that moment, Micah understood that his self-imposed isolation was over. No matter what had happened to him in the past, no matter how many times he swore never to be humanity's shield again, he could not stand by. The overhead LED strips pulsed red as the bunker system recognized a high-threat scenario. Micah keyed in an access code, stepping inside the armory that receded behind hidden panels in the wall. Rows of carefully maintained weapons glimmered dully under fluorescent lights, tools from a war he had tried so hard to forget. "Activate surface lift," he said, ignoring the dryness in his throat. The AI beeped in acknowledgement. As the whir of mechanical gears kicked in, Micah felt an old, familiar energy coil in his gut. Fear, yes, but also the unyielding sense of purpose that had once made him a legend among certain circles. His hands danced over the weapon racks, selecting a coil-burst rifle, a sidearm that fired superheated flechettes, and a utility belt lined with grenades specialized for spectral distortions. These items were relics of battles long past, but they might still hold up to the threat now spreading above ground. Footage from the scanning drones continued to flash on his visor. The Seraph ship had crashed 3 miles north of the bunker, carving a ravine in the desert like a meteor strike. Burning fragments dotted the sand. In the flicker of sparks, Micah detected 2 distinct heat signatures. One adult, one child. Together they struggled away from the wreck, the adult form limping. Meanwhile, the spectral anomaly glided ominously closer. Crystalline tendrils coiled at the edges of the frame, warping the physical environment into nightmarish fractals. Micah exhaled unsteadily. "A child," he muttered again, mustering his resolve. Despite everything, that single thought propelled him into motion. The elevator surfaced with a hiss of hydraulic release, and the moment the armored door slid apart, a blast of desert wind hit Micah full force. 5 years of climate-controlled air had done little to prepare him for the searing, gritty burn of sand-laden gusts. Even through the exosuit's environmental cushioning, he tasted the iron tang of dust. Above, the sky smoldered with twilight's glow, but the real beacon was the distant crash site, illuminated by the ephemeral radiance of Seraph machinery still discharging. Micah pressed 2 fingers to a side panel on his helmet, syncing up with his roaming drones. Their vantage revealed a frantic tableau, a tall, emerald-skinned Seraph woman carrying a young boy, sprinting across the dunes. She was battered, her silver-white hair matted with sweat or possibly blood. Her free hand glowed with intermittent bursts of energy, an uncanny Seraph ability to manipulate certain elemental forces. But the effect sputtered and vanished as she staggered. The boy in her arms clung to her, eyes large and dark with terror. Behind them, the spectral phenomenon advanced. It was forming into a humanoid outline, a being that pulsed with crystalline symmetry nearly 15 feet tall. Micah recalled the briefings he once read during the earliest outbreak. Some humans, desperate to merge with this alien perfection, had undergone transformations. The spectrals coaxed them into a kind of ascension, rewriting their biology on the spot. The husks left behind were no longer human, no longer anything recognizable, just symmetrical fractals of living crystal. The ephemeral voice that hissed through the desert wind seemed to confirm that. "Surrender the child," it boomed. "Its code is vital to the next step of evolution." That voice, alien and human at once, sent ice-cold dread through Micah's veins. The woman stumbled, and the boy cried out. Without further hesitation, Micah toggled his external speakers. "Over here," he shouted. He fired a warning shot, the plasma round sizzling into the sky to get their attention. The woman's head snapped around. Even from this distance, he perceived a flicker of hope spark across her radiant green features. She pivoted, straining toward him. The spectral giant moved with disconcerting fluidity, each step seeming to warp the ground itself. "You interfere with inevitability," it pronounced, turning a crystalline face towards Micah. "Remove yourself from the equation." And you can shove your inevitability where the sun doesn't shine, Micah spat, raising his rifle. He fired off several bursts of concentrated plasma. The beams impacted the crystal skin, fracturing the surface with spiderweb cracks. For a split second, he thought he had gained an advantage. Then, almost mockingly, the cracks sealed themselves. Micah's teeth ground together. He had seen this regenerative property before. High-impact or exotic weapons often shattered the surface layers, but the living crystal always regenerated at an accelerated rate. The Seraph woman took advantage of the spectral's brief distraction. She pumped her glowing hand, creating a ripple that seemed to solidify the desert air. Then she darted forward, using that ephemeral shield to deflect crystalline shards hurled at her child. "Help us!" she yelled, voice hoarse. "Please!" Micah motioned hurriedly with one arm, directing her to an outcropping of rocks near the bunker elevator. He unleashed a volley of plasma grenades at the spectral's feet, forcing it to slow its pursuit while the explosives tore at the desert floor. "You're going to want to move faster than that," he growled into his mic. Behind him, the elevator stood open like a mouth leading to safety. It was a direct path, but it was also painfully exposed across a 40-yard stretch. He crouched and fired again, aiming low to keep the spectral entity pinned. Each time he fired, the recoil jarred memories of old operations, old regrets. He couldn't dwell on them, not if he wanted to keep these two survivors alive. The woman vaulted a chunk of smoldering wreckage, her movements quick despite her injuries. She reached Micah, breath ragged, chest heaving under the remnants of a protective suit. Up close, her eyes were a vivid, molten gold, set into a face as sharply elegant as a carved statue. She cradled the boy gently, even though she was trembling from exertion. My name is Lyra," she managed between gasps. "He's Kai. Please, we can't let it take him." Micah nodded once, not trusting himself to respond with more than a curt acknowledgement. Then he turned, rifle raised, to face the advancing spectral. "We're heading down," he told Lyra. "Stay behind me." The entity seemed to swell, crystalline arms branching into fractal patterns that glimmered malevolently under the dimming sky. Another volley of projectiles tore through the air, and Micah's shield generator crackled in protest as it absorbed the impact. He clenched his jaw, letting off a rapid burst of return fire that forced the spectral to reel back. Lightning crackled around Lyra's fingertips. She mustered enough of her seraph powers to create a bright, swirling vortex that temporarily blocked the path of the spectral. "Go," she said, voice rough. "It won't hold." Together they sprinted toward the open elevator. In the glass reflection of his visor, Micah glimpsed the boy's frightened face pressed against Lyra's shoulder. The moment they reached the lift platform, Micah stabbed the control, and the doors whined shut. As the elevator sank beneath the desert surface, he caught one last glimpse of the towering, crystalline form beyond. It glowed with furious fractals, a living monolith crowned by spiked edges. "This is not over," it declared, voice echoing with inhuman undertones. "All things return to the spectrals in the end." Micah's heart hammered a staccato beat. The elevator rumbled downward, carrying them into relative safety. Yet safety was a tenuous term. The spectrals had a way of breaching fortifications. He had experienced their relentless corruption once before, and the nightmares never truly left him. As the doors opened to the bunker's main chamber, the overhead lights bathed the trio in sterile illumination. Micah drew a shaking breath. "Are you hurt?" he asked, turning to Lyra. She was panting, sweat beading along her temple, but she lifted her chin in defiance. "Not so badly that I can't fight," she replied, shifting Kai from one arm to the other. "But if we don't find a more permanent barrier, the spectral will breach your bunker." Micah felt his stomach knot. He swallowed hard, leading them deeper inside. "Then we better hope my old contingencies are enough," he said tersely, "because I doubt it's just going to give up and leave us alone." The bunker's interior was a labyrinth of corridors, storerooms, and control stations, all designed to maintain life and withstand sieges. Built decades earlier by military contractors, it had been Micah's refuge since the day he chose to vanish from the wider world. Panels of brushed steel lined the hallways, illuminated by flickering lights that fed on backup power. Each step echoed with a subdued clang, as if the bunker had only now awakened from slumber. Once they were secured behind a set of blast doors, Micah led Lyra and Kai into a cramped medbay. Set him down, Micah said, gesturing to a padded bench. I'll check for injuries. Lyra complied, though her own posture was stiff with tension. Beneath the overhead lamp, Micah got a better look at the boy. Sandy brown hair, eyes that were more golden than brown, a few faint scales or ridges across his cheeks that hinted at seraph ancestry. He wasn't purely human. That alone wasn't surprising. Human-seraph hybrids had been rumored to exist since first contact, though the ratio of such births was extremely low. Kai stared at Micah with an intensity that felt far too mature for a child. "Will the crystal monster find us?" he asked. His voice quivered, but it was steadied by raw determination. Micah tried to slow the racing of his heart. "It might try," he said honestly, rummaging for a med scanner, "but we'll be ready." He held the scanner over Kai's small frame. The device whirred softly, projecting a field of scanning light. Micah studied the readouts on a small screen: elevated adrenaline, signs of minor dehydration, superficial abrasions. Nothing life-threatening. "He's okay," Micah assured Lyra. A wave of relief washed over her luminous features. She sagged a little, letting out a shaky breath. "Thank you." Micah offered a curt nod, then turned the scanner on Lyra herself. He found a few contusions along her ribs, but nothing that required immediate surgery. Her physiology was adapted to Earth-like conditions, though there were some anomalies. A swirl of bioluminescent patterns just under her skin hinted at some advanced cellular architecture he couldn't fully parse without a Seraph database. He set the scanner aside, letting the tension break with a small sigh. "You two can rest in the living quarters down the hall," he said. "I'll set the security system to full lockdown. If that thing tries to force its way in, we'll know." Lyra's gaze flicked to him, searching for signs of deception. The faint glow in her eyes reminded him that Seraphs had extrasensory abilities. She might have been reading his emotional state. "I appreciate the hospitality," she replied, voice measured. "But the spectral that attacked us, it's no ordinary soldier. It's a conduit, a higher-level merge. It can corrupt matter itself and shape reality into fractals. My people call it Xanthus, though it was once a human scientist named Samson Reed who led us into an ambush." Micah stiffened. The notion of a powerful spectral entity twisted from the mind of a human scientist turned his stomach. It dovetailed all too well with the rumors he had tried to forget. Human individuals volunteering to fuse with the spectrals, becoming unstoppable harbingers. "You said it wants Kai," Micah murmured, glancing at the boy. "Why?" Something akin to panic rippled across Lyra's face. She looked away, biting her lower lip. Kai gazed up at them, curious, as if weighing the adult conversation with more comprehension than a child should possess. "He's special," Lyra finally said, voice subdued. "Kai's unique among seraph-human hybrids. He's able to interface with certain ancient technologies that neither species can fully control alone. If the conduit obtains him—" She shuddered, unable to finish. Her posture tensed. "It'll use him as a living key. That would allow the spectrals to break through reality's fabric more easily, rewriting everything in their crystalline image." Micah felt his heart thrum in his chest like a drum. He'd known from the start that saving these two meant entangling himself in something larger. But hearing it spelled out was worse. "So you came to Earth to find help, or at least a hiding place from Xanthus," Micah deduced, "and you ended up crash-landing practically on my doorstep." Lyra nodded. "I'd heard rumors about a soldier named Dorn, someone who'd deserted the main theaters, but had enough skill and resourcefulness to hold off an entire spectral incursion. The legend said you'd do anything to save a child." Her golden gaze, raw with sincerity, locked onto him. "I was desperate. I wanted to believe the stories." He looked away, swallowing. Memories churned within him. The frantic days when the spectrals first appeared, the desperate measures he took to contain them, the people he lost. "Those stories aren't all they're made out to be, he muttered. "I barely saved anyone. That's why I'm down here, off the grid. I left the fight." "You saved us tonight," she pointed out gently. Then her voice trembled. "And for that, I can never repay you. But Kai is in greater danger than you realize. Xanthus will not stop. It can't. We have to leave. Find a place more secure than even your bunker. or else we all die. Micah took a breath and steadied himself against the wave of dread threatening to overpower him. First, he said, let's reinforce our defenses. We can't just head out into the desert unprepared. In the distance, an ominous vibration resonated through the bunker's foundations, an unnatural hum that made the metal walls quiver. The conduit was testing his perimeter. He locked eyes with Lyra, then Kai. The child looked back at him trustingly, as if Micah alone could keep them safe from the entire universe. That kind of trust was more terrifying than any cosmic threat. They convened in the bunker's main control room, a cramped chamber lined with rows of aging computer terminals and monitors that flickered with dull green readouts. Micah's personal AI system, a leftover from military research, ran predictive simulations on how long the bunker could withstand a direct spectral assault. The results were disheartening. Multiple points of potential infiltration showed up as pulsing red icons on the schematic. If the conduit pushes hard, we might hold for a few hours, but certainly not days, Micah said grimly. If it merges with enough matter outside, it'll just keep growing. The fractals will push through cracks in the rock or corrode our air filtration intakes. Eventually, it will find a way in. Lyra stood with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable, though the swirling luminescence under her skin betrayed her worry. We can't outrun it if we stay here, she said. And if it's truly determined to capture Kai, the conduit won't waste time either. Kai sat on a stool at the edge of the room. Micah cast a sidelong look, noticing how calm the boy appeared, considering the cataclysm swirling around them. Childlike innocence or a seraph trait? Perhaps both. Is there any place you know of, Micah asked Lyra, somewhere we can get the heavy firepower we need to kill that thing for good, or shield ourselves if it can't be killed? There's a vault, Lyra said slowly, as if weighing whether to divulge a deep secret, in a region called Death Valley. Ancient machines built by an extinct civilization. My people call them the predecessors. The vault can generate high-level reality stabilizers. The spectrals can't exist where the vault's energy field is at maximum. But it's not easy to access. You need a caretaker, someone who can interface with it. Her gaze fell on Kai. Micah understood. The child was the caretaker. Micah cursed under his breath. A hair-raising plan began to take shape in his mind. They would have to travel directly into the desert wastes, pass beyond areas heavily scarred by earlier spectral encounters, and reach the vault's location. The entire route would be a gauntlet. Then that's where we go, he said at last. But not before we get reinforcements. Lyra tilted her head. You have alliances left? People who'd still answer your call? Micah's jaw tightened. One or two, maybe. But whether they'll trust a seraph is another question. Our alliance with your people wasn't exactly smooth after the first contact events and everything else that came afterward. Lyra's lips pressed into a firm line. She bowed her head. I know. We didn't arrive at an ideal time. By the time humanity realized the spectrals were a shared threat, it was already too late for so many. Micah rummaged through a box of old communication gear, pulling out a transmitter the size of his palm. He flicked several toggles and a faint hum crackled. This is Dorn, he said, voice low, addressing the static. If anyone's listening, I need backup. Repeat, I need backup. A moment passed, then another. The comm hissed with empty air. Suddenly a voice cut through the noise. Micah Dorn, thought you were dead. The unmistakable edge of Colonel Aria Reyes, once a close associate during the earliest spectral skirmishes. She had saved his life more times than he could count. But their alliance had dissolved when Micah abandoned the mission in the aftermath of a horrific containment failure. Reyes, he answered, clearing his throat. I'm in southern Nevada. Coordinates uploading now. We've got a high-level spectral presence and a seraph named Lyra plus her child. We need immediate assistance. 5 years of silence, and now you want help with an alien stowaway? You've got nerve. Her reply was laced with ice. But after a beat, she added, I've got a caravan, about 4 vehicles, and a handful of troopers. We're holed up near the old Barstow outpost. Meet us halfway, or give me a reason to come your way. Fine, we'll come to you, Micah said, gripping the transmitter. He was about to sign off when the bunker's proximity alert shrieked again. The AI's voice droned in the background. Spectral incursion at sublevel vents. Structural compromise imminent. Reyes, we're compromised. We need to move. Fast. Her voice turned serious, all business. Understood. I'll send you my coordinates. If you get here in one piece, we'll talk. No promises about how my people react to your alien friend. Lyra, overhearing, set her jaw. If they cannot abide my presence, they should at least protect Kai, she murmured, though she looked uncertain. Micah ended the transmission, sweeping the worn communicator into a tactical pouch. We leave in 15 minutes, he announced. Pack light. A shriek of metal from somewhere above alerted them that the spectral infiltration was already underway. Lyra whirled, a swirl of emerald light dancing around her fingertips, tension in every line of her body. Kai hopped off the stool, slipping behind his mother. We'll never make it out if the vents are overtaken, Lyra stated, fear laced in her voice. Micah forced himself to project calm. I've got an alternate exit. It's an emergency shaft with minimal surface presence, one of the only ways out if the main elevator is blocked. Another thunderous clang rocked the bunker, and somewhere sparks flew as high-voltage wires overloaded. Micah had no illusions about returning here. By the time the Spectral finished rewriting the place, his safe haven would be a crystal tomb. Let's go, he said, ushering them to the corridor. The bunker's overhead lights flickered, and red emergency lighting bathed the walls in ominous crimson. He inhaled, adrenaline surging through his veins. This was it. He was about to leave behind 5 years of isolation. Everything he had done to ensure that he could hide from spectrals and from the guilt that haunted him. Now he was stepping back into the fight, with a vulnerable child and a seraph at his side. He glanced at Lyra one last time before leading the way. Her determined stride matched his, and for an instant, a sense of camaraderie pulsed between them. Maybe he hadn't lost all of himself out here in the desert, or maybe he was simply about to replicate the tragedy he had once fled. Micah banished the doubt. If saving a child meant risking his life, he'd accept that risk again. Micah's emergency shaft was located near the rear of the bunker, accessible through an unmarked corridor that had once been intended for covert infiltration. He keyed in a 6-digit passcode on a battered keypad, and a reinforced hatch hissed open. The dim overhead light revealed a tight cylinder dropping at least 30 feet underground. It opens to a drainage culvert, Micah explained. We'll have to climb a ladder, then walk about a mile to clear the perimeter. He motioned for Lyra to go first, but she paused. You hear that? She cocked her head. The faint scraping of fractals against metal drifted from deeper inside the bunker. She raised a hand, and arcs of green electricity danced between her fingertips. Micah's heart lurched. He'd seen that trick used in battles years ago, seraph lightning, harnessing bioelectric energy that could disrupt spectral formations. I'll cover the rear, he said. Take Kai. Get going. Lyra nodded, helping Kai onto the ladder. Micah spun, training his rifle on the corridor behind them. There, emerging in stuttering flickers of fluorescent light, came the spectral corruption. Shimmering crystal creeping across the walls, reticulating into branching shapes. The temperature seemed to drop, or maybe that was the fear snaking through his veins. Get moving, he urged again. I'll be right behind you. Kai disappeared down the shaft with surprising agility for a child. Lyra followed, her slender form vanishing after him. Micah fired a volley of plasma rounds at the creeping crystal. He had to buy them time. Each shot impacted with a hiss, fracturing chunks of the crystalline spread, but it regrew almost as fast as he damaged it. With a final backward glance to ensure Lyra and Kai were clear, Micah slung the rifle over his shoulder and grabbed the ladder's rails, sliding into the darkness. The overhead hatch automatically sealed behind him, but the distant shrieking of metal told him the spectral infiltration wouldn't be contained for long. At the bottom, the drainage tunnel yawned, surprisingly spacious. Dim lights on Micah's helmet illuminated slick concrete surfaces and a shallow trickle of brackish water underfoot. Lyra and Kai waited, scanning the area. This way, Micah said, pointing down the corridor. They trudged through the darkness, the air thick and musty. Every so often, tiny glints along the walls made Micah's stomach twist, slivers of crystal forming. The spectrals had begun to breach even here. A muffled explosion rattled overhead, knocking bits of debris from the ceiling. Kai clung to Lyra's side, eyes wide. Micah put a hand on the boy's shoulder as they walked. Stay close, he whispered. The fatherly tone in his voice surprised him. He had never had children of his own. His experiences with youth were largely confined to saving them from war zones in the earlier battles. Yet in Kai's presence, he felt an instinctive urge to protect. They moved in tense silence, the only sounds the distant throb of the bunker's alarms and the drip of water echoing through the tunnel. After a few minutes, the passage sloped upward. A metal grate sealed the exit, rusted at the edges from years of disuse. Micah pressed his shoulder against it. "We'll have to push," he said, "on my signal." He counted to 3 in his head and heaved. Lyra joined in, the combined force dislodging the grate in a shriek of rusted metal. Cool desert air rushed in. Night had fully fallen now, the moon casting a pallid glow across the rocky expanse. "Let's get out of this trench," Micah said, hauling himself up first. He offered a hand to Lyra, who in turn helped Kai scramble onto the surface. The hush of the desert struck him, broken only by the faint hum of wind. His bunker's main structure sat a few miles away, dark lumps in the distance. The minimal surface camouflage had concealed it from prying eyes. But now the upper levels showed slivers of that fractal shimmer. The spectral was already at work, rewriting the place in its own grotesque tapestry. "Goodbye, old friend," Micah whispered, a twisting ache in his chest. 5 years of living in that bunker. Gone. He couldn't linger. If he looked too long, he might be tempted to do something reckless, like try to salvage it. He turned to Lyra, whose face mirrored sympathy and determination. "Colonel Reyes said she's near Barstow. That's a fair drive. We need a vehicle." He rummaged in a hidden cache beneath a cluster of rocks, revealing a desert camo jeep. He hopped into the driver's seat, waiting for Lyra and Kai to buckle into the back. "Stay low," he instructed, scanning the horizon for any sign of immediate threats. The engine roared to life and they sped across the uneven terrain. Behind them, Micah swore he saw faint, shifting lights in the sky, as if a constellation of crystals were forming overhead. "It's tracking us," Lyra said softly, voice trembling at the edges. "The conduit will keep watching." "Let it watch," Micah muttered. "We'll be ready." He pressed the pedal, urging the jeep forward into the desert night. They traveled in near silence for over an hour, the desert wind howling around them. Kai nodded off at some point, exhaustion overcoming fear. Micah envied the child's resilience. In the rearview mirror, however, he saw Lyra's all silhouette, and as she cradled her son, gazed distant. An unspoken tension weighed on them. Would Colonel Reyes arrive with help or guns blazing? As they neared Barstow, they saw the glow of lights. Once a modest city along a major highway, most of its structures had been left to the desert after the initial wave of spectral corruption. Now only a fraction of the population remained, barricaded behind makeshift fortifications. Sentinel towers rose from the outskirts, scanning the horizon with stuttering floodlights. A chain-link fence topped with razor wire formed a perimeter. Scraps of old-world vehicles littered a staging area, some turned into watchtowers, others rusting in heaps. Micah slowed the jeep near what appeared to be a checkpoint. Armed figures emerged, flashlights dancing across the vehicle. One approached, a tall, angular woman wearing tactical gear. She aimed a rifle squarely at Micah's windshield. "ID yourself," she demanded. "I'm Micah Dorn," he called, raising both hands in a gesture of no harm. "Colonel Reyes is expecting me." The woman frowned, then motioned for him to step out. Micah complied. Lyra waited in the backseat, clutching Kai close. The woman peered at them, suspicion etched in every line of her face. Over her shoulder, another soldier jogged up. "Sergeant, that's the contact. Colonel's orders are to bring him in." The woman's gaze lingered on Lyra's green complexion and then on the sleeping child. "Fine," she muttered. "But any funny business?" "No business, funny or otherwise," Micah answered dryly. Within minutes, they were led through a series of barricades to a more central compound. The compound consisted of boxy, prefabricated structures, one of which sported a functioning radar dish. Colonel Reyes stood in front of that structure, arms crossed, her tall frame silhouetted by floodlights. She was lean but muscled, dark hair cropped close to her scalp, face lined by years of confrontation with unimaginable threats. She greeted Micah with a nod that carried more weight than mere words. "Dorn." Her gaze drifted behind him, landing on Lyra and Kai. A muscle in her jaw twitched. "So it's true." "It is," Micah replied. "We need your help, Colonel. Spectral infiltration is growing. A conduit, calling itself Xanthus, wants the boy. Without reinforcements, we won't last another day. Reyes exhaled sharply. We've had our own troubles with spectrals. Lost an outpost last month. Half my squad transformed. Her voice caught, though she quickly masked the pain. So you're not the only ones in need, but I'm not sure about housing an alien or a hybrid child. People here have lost a lot because of Seraphs. Some blame them for not warning us sooner or for dragging the spectrals to Earth in the first place. Lyra's posture stiffened. She lifted her chin. My people tried to help, Colonel. If we had known how quickly the spectrals would spread, perhaps we could have done more. But we didn't bring them here. They followed us because we discovered technology that threatened their illusions of perfection. Reyes shot her a steely look. Still, the result was war, and we're the ones paying in blood. She turned to Micah. We'll help you, because if we don't, the child ends up in spectral hands, and that might doom everything we've struggled to keep alive. But don't expect a hero's welcome. Micah glanced at Lyra. She responded with a nod of understanding. We only need your expertise and resources to reach Death Valley, she said. The vault there, Kai can activate something that might push back the spectrals for good. Reyes rubbed her eyes, clearly exhausted. Every route there is heavily corrupted or irradiated. That region was hammered by early attempts at containing the spectrals. It's lethal, but if you insist on going, my people and I will see if we can carve a safe path. Micah felt a tremor of relief. Thank you. We'll prepare to leave as soon as possible. Xanthus won't wait. Get your rest, Reyes said, pivoting toward her command post. At dawn, we strategize. Lyra exhaled, tension visibly leaving her shoulders. Kai stirred, blinking sleepily. Micah felt the weight of a long night finally press down on him. This was just the first step. Past the night's meager refuge lay a trek through a wasteland teeming with fractal nightmares and lethal radiation pockets, all leading to a vault that might or might not repel the conduit's final push. Yet as he walked with Lyra and Kai to a small cot in a side shelter, Micah felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in 5 years, he had allies. Maybe they could, against all odds, turn the tide. Dawn broke, a thread of gold on the horizon. Micah stepped outside onto what was once an asphalt parking lot, now cracked and pitted. Colonel Reyes' small militia bustled about, loading supplies onto a trio of reinforced trucks and a heavier transport for soldiers. The plan was simple on paper, but treacherous in reality. They'd skirt the edges of the spectral infected zone, crossing into the southwestern desert where the corruption was thinner, then circle north through a corridor rumored to be mostly clear. Once they reached Death Valley, the real challenge began, tackling the anomalies that had consumed the region. He found Lyra and Kai near the second truck. Lyra was instructing Kai on how to focus his energy, guiding him to breathe deeply and channel the subtle bioluminescence that pulsed under his skin. Micah silently admired how maternal she looked, something strong yet tender in her posture. Kai caught him watching and offered a small wave. Micah returned it, heart unexpectedly warmed by the gesture. Colonel Reyes emerged, datapad in hand. We're rolling out in 10, she announced. Her gaze swept over Lyra before settling on Micah. Any last-minute confessions about your friend's powers or the boy's abilities that might affect our mission? Lyra's eyes flickered. I can conjure energy shields, limited telekinetic pulses, short-range EMP bursts if needed. Kai has some of these traits, but they're underdeveloped. He's more important for the vault systems. A living key. Reyes nodded skeptically. Let's hope we'll need his key sooner rather than never. The more time we spend out there, the more we risk drawing the spectrals on us. She pivoted, barking orders at a mechanic to check the truck's radiation filters. We depart in 5. Micah moved to help Lyra and Kai onto one of the trucks. He glanced behind to see a few militia members glaring at the Seraph woman. Ignore them, he whispered. Focus on going to the mission. Lyra gave him a weary smile. Easy to say, not so easy to do. Once aboard, the convoy rumbled out. Within minutes, the settlement receded in the dust behind them, and they were left with the broad, empty horizon. Micah rode beside Colonel Reyes in the lead vehicle, scanning for threats. He couldn't help but notice how quiet she was, all that tension coiled under her stoic facade. As the hum of the engine filled the cabin, he remembered the last time they'd fought side by side in White Sands. how they'd nearly lost everything. Her voice broke the silence. "Why come back now, Dorn? You vanished after White Sands. We thought you had died with the rest." Micah stared out the window, gathering his thoughts. "I lost faith," he said simply. "After seeing how unstoppable they seemed, after losing the people I cared about, I retreated, shut out the world. This kid, Kai, he's the only reason I'm back." The colonel pursed her lips, but some of her anger seemed to recede. "Well, I'm glad you are, for what it's worth. We need you." He nodded, acknowledging her words without voicing the complicated swirl of guilt and resolution in his chest. The desert unrolled ahead of them, a stage set for confrontation. No matter the outcome, Micah had crossed the point of no return. He only hoped that, this time, the future they fought for would not be shattered by perfect, unyielding crystal. Morning sunlight blazed against the dusty windshields of the convoy as it rattled along a desert highway, scarcely recognizable from its pre-war maps. Here and there, battered remnants of civilization poked out like bones in the sand. Half-collapsed motels, rusted gas pumps, and highway signs nearly bleached blank by years of relentless sun. Colonel Aria Reyes insisted on leading the column in her armored transport, a reinforced personnel carrier rigged with sensor arrays salvaged from old military depots. Micah Dorn sat beside her, rifle laid across his lap, scanning for threats on every side. More than once he caught glimpses of glinting crystalline shapes on the horizon, fleeting visions that made his throat tighten. But each time they vanished before he could focus on them. Behind them, two camouflage trucks carried Lyra and her son, Kai, along with a half-dozen militia fighters. Additional hardware, grenade launchers, shield generators, and precious canisters of experimental anti-spectral grenades rode in a cargo trailer that clanked and rattled with every jolt. The caravan moved in wary silence, dust spiraling up from the wheels, creating a massive cloud that would be visible for miles. It couldn't be helped. Speed was essential. If they lingered, Xanthus and its thralls would close in. "What's your read on that sky?" Reyes asked, pointing through the reinforced windshield. Micah squinted. The desert air shimmered unnaturally in places, warping the landscape into a rippling mirage. At first he assumed it was just the heat, but flickers of luminescent geometry flicked at the edges, a sign of spectral distortion. "We're cutting it close," he said, running a hand through his hair. "If that's a full-blown anomaly, we might have to detour." Reyes swore under her breath. "We don't have time for a wide detour. We've been monitoring radiation pockets all morning. Most alternate routes are still too hot. Last I checked, the southwestern approach had borderline contamination levels. At best, we can hope to cross quickly before it fries our systems. Or us." She lifted her comm device and relayed instructions to the rest of the convoy, ordering them to tighten formation and boost the radiation shielding. Their plan of attack had always been precarious: outrun or slip around spectral territory, aiming for Death Valley from an unexpected angle. But the route was riddled with leftover hazards from battles fought years ago, including sites where entire towns had been bombed in desperate attempts to contain the crystalline corruption. Micah kept his gaze on the shifting horizon. "We'll have to keep moving until we hit the remains of that old military airfield. We can stop there for a quick resupply, maybe glean heavier weapons if they haven't been stripped." Reyes nodded but said nothing, her jaw clenched. Tension coiled in the air between them like a drawn bowstring. Behind them in the second truck, Lyra peered out at the desert with eyes that missed nothing. Her features reflected deep unease. She sensed Xanthus in the distance. Micah knew because each time she caught a hint of the conduit's presence, she drew Kai closer. The boy, for his part, stared out the window with a strange, quiet resolve. From time to time, he placed a hand on the metal side panel, as if trying to soothe the old vehicle, or perhaps to sense vibrations Micah couldn't detect. His gifts were still half a mystery to everyone, including his mother. Reyes finally broke the tense silence in the lead vehicle. "If that conduit follows us directly, we won't have a prayer. All we can do is hope we're important enough for it to track, but not important enough to crush instantly." Micah exhaled a humorless laugh. The entire plan hinged on the assumption that Xanthus would want Kai alive more than it wanted them dead. "Let's not rely on hope alone," he said. "We'll find those heavier weapons, or, at the very least, secure enough material to fortify ourselves." I still have a few old tricks in mind. They continued through the bleak landscape. Where once traffic bustled and neon signs lured tourists, only battered skeletons of civilization stood as monuments to Earth's abrupt shift toward ruin. Radio static crackled occasionally on the speakers, scanning for signals, human, seraph, or otherwise. No friendly voices replied, only the ambient hum of cosmic interference and, once in a while, the faint, spine-chilling echoes of fractal transmissions. At least, Micah was fairly sure he heard them, a symphony of tinkling chimes that formed maddeningly precise patterns. It was either the environment playing tricks on him or the distant whisper of spectral expansions waiting to pounce. They arrived at what used to be the Coleman airfield near midday. The scorching sun beat down mercilessly, sending waves of heat distortion rippling across the tarmac. The airfield's runways were cracked and cluttered with twisted scraps of metal, fuselages of old military planes cannibalized for parts. In the distance, large hangars stood silent like tombs, doors sagging open. A few rusted vehicles dotted the perimeter, jeeps, half-tracks, even the shell of a helicopter gunship. Spread out but stay in sight, Reyes ordered. She directed her units to sweep the area for usable ordnance or salvageable armor plating. Micah hopped down from the lead vehicle, scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. Lyra and Kai joined him, while a pair of militia fighters tagged behind, rifles at the ready. The scorching air smelled faintly of oil and sand. Kai wrinkled his nose. "This place feels weird," he murmured. Lyra squeezed his hand gently. "Be on guard," Micah advised, checking his own weapon. "Spectrals might have left watchers or traps. Keep your mother in sight." Kai nodded, though an odd glimmer shone in his golden brown eyes. His senses, sharpened by his dual heritage, were probably detecting subtle energies Micah could hardly imagine. They advanced toward a squat building that might have served as a control tower. The windows were shattered, and shards of glass crunched underfoot. Lyra bristled when she spotted a faint pattern of crystalline residue along one wall. The prismatic shimmer in the sunlight told a story of long-past infiltration. "We must be careful," she whispered. "Even old deposits can flare up if activated by fresh energy." Micah nodded, carefully nudging aside a piece of debris with the barrel of his rifle. Inside, darkness clung to every corner. The group activated their flashlights, beams cutting through motes of dust. A corridor led to a control room where a bank of archaic monitors and knobs sat unpowered. One of the militia guards riffled through a drawer, pulling out battered logs and half-burned maps. "Nothing about advanced weapons," he said, disappointed. Micah swept his flashlight across the floor, pausing on a half-cracked door labeled Armory, authorized personnel only. The lock had been blasted or melted. He gave the door a shove, metal scraping over tile as it swung inward. The small armory was largely stripped. Empty racks hinted at rifles long gone, and crates sat pried open with contents stolen or rotted. Still in the corner behind collapsed shelves, Micah's flashlight caught the glint of something. He approached warily, a metal cylinder about the length of a forearm with intricate wiring coiled around its surface. He stooped to pick it up, seeing no immediate sign of spectral influence. Lyra's eyes widened. "Is that?" "One of the old Quake charges," Micah replied, wiping dust off the device. "Experimental ordnance meant to disrupt spectral geometry with concussive pulses. We only managed to produce a handful before factories went dark." He traced a finger along the etched label. The battery pack was still sealed, but whether it had any life left was another question. Even if it's half charged, it might buy us time in a pinch. He slipped it into a spare pouch, then continued scanning for more. The building groaned ominously, the structure weakened by years of neglect and possible infiltration. Kai stuck close, every so often brushing his hand along the walls as if listening to an unspoken language. When Micah flicked a questioning glance, Lyra offered a faint shrug. "He senses energies. Even non-living structures can carry echoes." The group found no further weaponry beyond a few dusty grenades, which might or might not be stable. With a grim sense of anticlimax, they returned to the scorching daylight. Reyes and her teams were likewise rummaging through hangars, turning up minimal goods, some half-rotted medical supplies, scraps of bulletproof plating, a rusted turret. Disappointment lay thick in the air, heightened by the knowledge that they were losing precious hours. Overhead, The sky shimmered again in that fractal manner, like a broken mirror catching light. Something was closing in. Suddenly, a distant scream rippled across the empty runway. Everyone tensed. Reyes barked into her radio. "Report!" A crackle of static preceded the frantic voice of a scout. "Spectral movement, northwest corner. I see. Oh God, they're not." The transmission dissolved in a burst of static. Micah felt a jolt of dread twist in his gut. "Positions!" Reyes roared. Militia fighters scrambled into defensive stances, scanning the horizon. Micah, Lyra, and Kai hurried to the vehicles. In the distance, dust rose in swirling columns, out of which emerged shapes that looked human at first, until the sunlight caught the prismatic sheen of their bodies. At least 5, maybe more. Fractally reshaped forms marched steadily forward, arms extended in a grotesque parody of welcome. Beside them, the swirling dust formed crystalline fractals that seemed to bloom into existence. Lyra's breath hitched. "We're out of time." Micah grit his teeth. His fear was overshadowed by the muscle memory of countless fights. "Everyone to the vehicles," he snapped. "We hold them off as long as we can, then we run." The runway erupted into chaotic battle. Crystalline shapes, former humans, twisted by spectral rewriting, fanned out in unnaturally perfect formation. Some had elongated arms that jutted into blade-like edges. Others were covered in geometric spikes reflecting rainbow patterns under the sun. They advanced with eerie coordination, ignoring the scorching heat as if it meant nothing to them. Militia squads opened fire, bullets ricocheting off hardened crystal surfaces or lodging into the fractal spines to minimal effect. Micah barked an order for the troopers to switch to plasma rounds and laser lances. He unleashed a volley from his rifle, bright arcs of energy slamming into the first wave of attackers. One shape staggered, fracturing around its torso before reassembling with a horrifying ripple. Beside him, Colonel Reyes fired in rapid bursts, cursing each time a direct hit failed to drop a target completely. Whatever these forms had been, they retained only a whisper of human vulnerability. Lyra took a position by one of the trucks, her eyes blazing with emerald light. She raised both hands, and a swirl of energy gathered, coalescing into a shield that deflected incoming shards. Narrow, crystalline projectiles spat from the spectral thralls. Kai stayed low behind the wheel well, peeking around with a mixture of terror and fierce focus. Micah caught sight of the boy's small face, set, determined. Then he forced himself to concentrate on the immediate threat. The thralls were flanking the convoy, splitting their forces. "Keep them away from the cargo trailer," Reyes shouted. "We lose those shield generators and we're done." A group of militia members tried to form a defensive line near the trailer, but fractal spikes tore through the air like spears. Micah sprinted forward, firing a plasma burst that disintegrated one spike mid-flight. Another trooper jettisoned a fragmentation grenade, which exploded in a bright flash, temporarily scattering 2 crystalline forms. He heard Lyra cry out behind him. A thrall had circled around, launching a barrage of crystalline shards at her position. She raised an arm, conjuring a luminescent barrier, but the force of the impact shoved her back. Micah swung his rifle around and fired off a tight cluster of shots that hammered into the thrall's flank. Cracks spread across its torso. For a moment, it looked as if it might crumble. Then, with unnatural fluidity, it reorganized, turning its faceted head toward Micah. He felt a chill as though it recognized him, or recognized the significance of who he was protecting. His mind raced. The quake charge. It might be their best shot at crowd control. Reaching into his belt, he yanked out the metal cylinder. Power readings flickered on its side. 48% battery. Maybe enough for one good pulse. As the thrall reared up, arms morphing into razor-edged fractals, Micah slammed the device against the cracked runway, twisting the activation ring. A low hum resonated, building to a deafening whine. "Hit the deck!" he roared. Lyra dove, covering Kai with her body. Reyes and her squad flattened themselves behind vehicles. The thrall lunged, too late to stop what came next. The quake charge unleashed a dome of distortion, an invisible wave that tore through the area with the force of a localized earthquake. The thrall in front of Micah shattered, crystal shards raining down. Beyond it, 3 more thralls lurched under the pulse, cracks webbing across their bodies. One managed to hold form, but it staggered backward like a dazed marionette. Micah's ears rang, his vision blurred. He tasted blood on his lip, likely from the concussion wave. But it worked. The spectral ranks were broken, giving them an opening to retreat. "Everyone, now!" Reyes bellowed, her voice barely audible over the hollow roar echoing in Micah's head. The convoy roared to life, engines revving. Troopers scrambled aboard, leaving behind anything they couldn't grab in the next few seconds. Lyra scooped Kai into the truck and slid into the passenger seat, with Micah practically diving behind the wheel. He heard Colonel Reyes in the radio earpiece. "Dorn, lead us west. Engage boosters if you have them." Through the dust-laden air, Micah caught glimpses of the thralls reassembling. Though they moved with difficulty, a few still crawled across the ground, their crystalline limbs dragging behind. With numb hands, Micah slammed his foot on the gas, the truck lurching forward into the desert beyond the airfield. The battered tarmac receded in the rearview mirrors, replaced by the blinding haze of sunlight on dust. Sweat dripped into Micah's eyes, stinging them. He blinked furiously, willing his focus to remain. Lyra, breath heaving, cradled Kai. The boy kept glancing over his shoulder, as if searching for shapes in the swirling dust. Once again, Micah was forced to flee, forced to leave behind a battlefield strewn with the remnants of old hopes. But he told himself it wasn't a defeat, not this time. They drove for hours, pushing the vehicles to their limits. Reyes insisted they press on, though the heat index threatened to overtax engines and radiators. The desert itself transformed into an otherworldly stretch of cracked flats and ridges that shimmered under the sun. Every so often they glimpsed ephemeral shapes dancing along the horizon, no doubt the vestiges of spectral distortions that laced the atmosphere. The confrontation at the airfield had accomplished little beyond staving off an immediate ambush. Xanthus, or some portion of its forces, would remain in pursuit. Eventually, Reyes ordered a halt near a scattering of boulders large enough to offer partial shade. Mechanics scrambled to check coolant levels on each truck, while medics distributed water and rummaged through first aid kits for any sign of radiation sickness. Micah leaned against the fender of his vehicle, struggling to quell the tremor in his hands. The quake charge's concussive feedback still rattled his nerves. Lyra approached, her face drawn. She pressed a canteen into his hand. "Drink," she said softly. He took a gulp, letting the tepid water soothe his parched throat. Glancing over, he saw Kai curled up on the truck's back seat, eyes distant. "Is he okay?" Micah asked. Lyra nodded faintly. "He's just tired. The presence of the spectrals unnerves him. He senses their intentions, like a static that grates on his mind." An uneasy quiet stretched between them. In it, Micah felt the weight of something unspoken. Perhaps it was the memory of how close they'd come to being overrun, or the knowledge that they still had miles of peril ahead. He shifted awkwardly. "What you did out there, the shield, the blasts, it saved lives. Thank you." Lyra's gaze flickered with mild surprise. "You've nothing to thank me for. If we don't stop Xanthus soon, all life on Earth is at risk. Seraph, human, it won't matter." Before Micah could respond, Colonel Reyes marched over, brow knit in frustration. "We've lost 3 of our men. Their truck was hit by those thralls while we retreated. We can't go back for them." She pressed her lips tightly, letting the implication hang in the air. If they still lived, they would be thralls by now. Another addition to Xanthus's ranks. Micah shook his head, anger and sorrow mixing into a bitter taste. "We can't keep bleeding people like this." Reyes nodded. "We've got a partial route mapped out. The meltdown zone to the southwest is dangerous, but if we push through quickly, the radiation might be survivable with our suits. After that, we're close to the valley's outskirts. I don't know what condition it's in now. Rumor says the region has changed dramatically. No one's returned from deeper expeditions." Lyra inhaled slowly, her luminescent patterns flickering in subdued waves. "We have no choice. The vault in Death Valley is our only hope of stopping this once and for all. The spectrals can't freely warp areas fortified by the predecessor's technology. If Kai can fully interface with that system, we may sever Xanthus's hold on reality here." Reyes stared at the woman's emerald complexion, the same flicker of distrust lingering in her eyes. But the colonel gave a curt nod. "Fine. We head out as soon as the vehicles cool. If Xanthus catches us in the meltdown zone, we might not have the strength to fend it off." Micah glanced back at Kai, who dozed against a pile of spare gear. The child's presence was a stark reminder of how deeply everything hinged on him. A small part of Micah hated that. No child should carry a burden so monumental. Yet there was no other path. "We have to be fast," he said at last. "But we also need to be smart." Reyes chewed on her lip. "Then we make final checks now. Once we're in meltdown territory, we can't stop until we're clear on the other side. Any extended exposure will kill us." She strode away, barking orders to the nearest mechanic. Micah watched her with a tangled sense of admiration and resentment. She was leading them into hell, but it was a hell with at least a glimmer of hope at the far side. "Here," Lyra said, extending a small medallion etched with serif symbols. "It's an environmental stabilizer, admittedly minor, but it helps filter out some radiation." "Wear it." Micah hesitated, then slipped it around his neck, feeling a faint pulse of foreign energy. It reminded him of that morning's rush, the sense that he was forging a new alliance, one beyond old prejudices. "Thanks," he murmured. Lyra mustered a weary smile. "Don't mention it. You're keeping us alive in more ways than one." Then she returned to Kai's side, and Micah steeled himself for the next leg of their dangerous journey. High noon found them on the ragged edge of the meltdown zone, a swath of land scarred by early experiments to eradicate the spectrals through nuclear force. The effort had failed. The blast destroyed entire cities but barely slowed the spread of fractal corruption. Now the region lay under a shimmering haze of residual radiation. Twisted metal frames jutted from the sand, once buildings, now skeletal silhouettes. The heat grew oppressive, and the vehicle's Geiger counters clicked steadily, a grim lullaby that promised a slow, invisible death if they lingered too long. Reyes's voice crackled through the convoy's comms. "We go in tight formation. Stay close, keep speed, watch the rad meters. If they climb above threshold, we push faster." The plan was to carve a straight path through in one shot. Any stop or breakdown could be fatal. Micah's truck led the way, with Reyes in the passenger seat this time, scanning readouts. Lyra and Kai were in the second vehicle, now driven by a capable young militia soldier. Two additional trucks followed, bearing the rest of their contingent. As soon as they crossed into the zone, the air felt heavier. Vibrations thrummed in the ground, making Micah's teeth ache. Occasionally, he spotted lumps of what might have been crystalline spires or melted slag fused into the sand. The hush was eerie. No wind, no animals, just the hum of engines and the crackle of radiation detectors. A few times they passed shapes that might once have been people, statues of glassy, contorted forms. Micah forced himself not to look too closely. The meltdown's cruelty was etched into every corner of the landscape. A tremor suddenly shook the ground, causing the vehicles to swerve. "Earthquake?" Reyes muttered, gripping the dash. The readings on her display spiked, then settled. "More like a localized distortion," Micah answered grimly. "Xanthus might be probing or trying to coerce the environment." Another rattle reverberated through the convoy, stronger this time. Dust rose, and one truck's tires skidded in loose sand. Over the radio, someone swore they saw crystalline flickers overhead, like a partial sky lattice forming. Micah pressed the accelerator, heart pounding. "If it forms a barrier above us, we'll be trapped in a radioactive oven." An urgent call came in. "This is Jensen on truck 3. Engine's overheating. We need a stop or we'll blow the gasket." Reyes inhaled sharply, eyes flicking to the radiation meter. They had planned for 0 stops. "Damn, Dorn, can we circle around?" Micah checked the terrain. "There's a small gorge to the south. Might give shade, but we can't lose too many minutes." Another quake rolled beneath them, as if the earth itself were breathing in tension. Reyes pressed the talk button. "Jensen, 2 minutes top. Get it done. Everyone else, perimeter formation while they fix it." They veered off into the gorge, a shallow dip where some boulders offered relief from direct sunlight. As they parked, mechanics jumped out, prying open truck hoods to vent steam. The radiation level was still too high for comfort, so they worked in protective masks and gloves. Lyra and Kai hurried to stand under a rock ledge. Micah joined them, scanning the ridge above for any sign of movement. Reyes's troopers fanned out, weapons ready. Then a hauntingly familiar sound drifted through the gorge, like chimes struck in an eerie harmony. Micah felt a chill race up his spine. Kai twitched, nearly doubling over as if the noise overwhelmed him. "They're close," the boy gasped. Lyra's eyes flared with green luminescence. "It's a fractal choir," she muttered in dread. "Spectrals forming a wave." Micah raised his rifle, peering over the edge of the gorge. The air rippled with prismatic distortion. In that shimmering haze, he glimpsed figures. No, partial figures, skittering across the ridge. They moved in a way that hurt his eyes, as if they existed on angled planes of reality. "Everyone, lock and load!" Reyes shouted. The troopers readied weapons, forming a defensive semicircle around the vehicles. The meltdown zone was already lethal. Now it threatened to become a war zone as well. Micah steeled himself, posture tensing. If the trucks were disabled, they'd be stranded here amid radiation, where the spectrals would pick them off at leisure. "Not again," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. He wouldn't lose more people like he did back at White Sands, not if he could help it. Those fractal shapes began to descend the slope, their limbs merging and splitting, crystalline facets refracting the sun into a kaleidoscope of colors. A wave of fear rippled through the militia, but Reyes's calm instructions kept them focused. Pick targets, maintain distance, secure the trucks. Micah's mind raced. He'd use the quake charge. It wouldn't have enough juice to replicate that blast. They had to rely on standard arms and whatever Seraph powers Lyra could deploy. This was the Meltdown Corridor's final hazard, the last line Xanthus had thrown at them before Death Valley. And from the look of those shifting forms, it was a line that might be impossible to cross unscathed. The instant the first fractal creature reached the gorge floor, the militia opened fire. Bullets and plasma rounds whipped through the dust-choked air, some cracking the crystal shells, others glancing off at lethal angles. One trooper took a ricochet to the shoulder, spinning him backward with a cry. Micah rushed forward, switching his rifle to a higher plasma setting. He aimed at a tall figure whose limbs arced in abstract geometry. The bolt impacted squarely, causing it to vibrate in place. Then it shattered into glimmering shards. But for every thrall destroyed, two more slipped into view. They glowed with the meltdown's latent energies, feeding off the environment's distortions. In the chaos, Lyra conjured a swirling vortex of emerald lightning, launching it at a cluster of thralls. The explosion sent fragments scattering, briefly clearing a path. Kai, standing behind her, watched with winding, determined eyes. Micah could sense the boy's desperation to help. Reyes ducked behind a boulder, radio crackling in her ear. "Mechanics, status?" A tense reply, "Still stabilizing the coolant system. Another minute or two." A minute or two might as well be an eternity in this onslaught. Micah could taste the bitterness of sweat and dust in his mouth, his heart hammering in his chest. Each shot from his rifle seared the air, the recoil jarring old injuries he thought he had forgotten. Suddenly, a cluster of thralls descended from the cliffs, flanking the militia line. Reyes caught sight too late. "Left flank! Look out!" She fired wildly, downing one, but the rest rushed in. A trooper screamed as fractal limbs impaled him, the crystals glistening with fresh blood. Micah pivoted, firing a burst that cracked open the thrall's crystalline hide. Another trooper hurled a grenade, but it only disrupted the formation momentarily. Lyra's voice rose in a wordless cry, and she dashed forward, ignoring Micah's warning shout. An arc of living electricity surged from her palms, snaking through multiple thralls. The effect was dramatic. They convulsed, fracturing and collapsing. But the strain left Lyra staggering, panting hard. The meltdown's radiation gnawed at her seraph physiology, and the repeated energy blasts clearly took their toll. Micah rushed to her side. "Don't overextend," he warned, covering her with a volley of plasma fire. She wiped sweat from her brow, eyes glimmering. "If I don't, we're all dead." A fresh wave of fractal shapes crested the ridge, swarming down like an unstoppable tide. Some hovered, half-formed, above the ground. Their faces, if one could call them faces, tilted toward the convoy with unnerving sentience. Micah realized their intentions: to demolish the trucks first, then pick off any survivors with ease. "Kai!" Lyra shouted, looking at her son. He took a trembling step forward, placing both hands on the ground. Micah sensed a pulsing resonance spread through the dirt, as if the boy tapped into an energy beyond normal comprehension. The fractals paused as though perplexed. One shape flickered, reconfiguring its limbs mid-step, but the respite was fleeting. Something more powerful stirred among them, a figure half again as large as the others, brimming with twisting spires of crystal. Its body hummed with a presence that made Micah's ears ring. For a moment, it felt as though Xanthus itself were focusing on them through that monstrous thrall, channeling a fraction of its own cosmic will. The creature's voice, a layered echo, rang out. The child. He must submit. Micah's breath caught. The entire battle froze in that cosmic heartbeat. Even the smaller thralls seemed to wait for the massive figure's next command. Then, with an echoing crack, the gargantuan thrall raised an arm and hurled a barrage of fractal shards the size of javelins straight at Kai. Lyra reacted instantly, sprinting to shield him. Micah charged forward, rifle blazing, trying to intercept the projectiles. One shard ricocheted off a truck's engine block, another embedded into the ground with bone-rattling force. A third clipped Lyra's arm, sending her sprawling. Kai fell backward with a startled cry. Micah nearly roared in fury. He pumped the rifle's trigger, unleashing round after round of superheated plasma into the giant thrall's chest. At first, cracks formed, blossoming outward. For a moment, it looked ready to implode, but a wave of fractal energy knitted it back together, the cracks sealing. "Colonel!" Micah shouted, voice ragged. Reyes and two troopers responded with covering fire, flanking the beast. Yet every shot seemed to do only superficial damage. Then the rumbling of an engine snapped Micah's attention sideways. The mechanic's voice crackled over the comm. "Truck's good to go!" Reyes seized the opening. "Fall back!" she shouted. The militia retreated, dragging wounded. Kai scrambled to help his mother up. Lyra pressed a hand to her bleeding arm, face contorted in pain, yet she still managed to raise a crackling bolt of green energy to fend off advancing thralls. Micah pivoted toward her. "Can you move?" Her reply was a determined nod, though she wobbled on her feet. In a frenetic swirl of dust and gunfire, they stumbled back toward the vehicles. One by one, trucks roared to life, tires spinning in the radioactive soil. The giant thrall stepped forward, fractal blade forming at the end of its arm, ready to cleave them apart. Micah had no quake charge left. He gritted his teeth, certain they might not escape this time. But just as the thrall raised its blade, Kai lifted a trembling hand, and a burst of unseen energy rippled outward. The giant staggered, halting mid-swing, its crystal arm fracturing from within. Micah didn't waste the chance. He yanked Lyra up into the truck, Kai diving in after them. With Reyes and the others, they floored the bomb engines roaring. The thrall lurched, regaining composure, but they were already pulling away, sprinting the vehicles down the gorge. Micah cast a glance through the rear window. The fractal horde swarmed behind, but the meltdown haze and the boys' unexpected interference had slowed their pursuit. Up front, Reyes urged them forward, deeper into the meltdown zone, counting on speed and the vehicle's battered shielding to hold back lethal radiation. Cradling Lyra against him, Micah felt a searing burn of tension in his chest. They were alive but battered and running on fumes, physically and spiritually. And Death Valley still lay ahead, an even greater challenge waiting in the heart of that lonely desert. Emerging from the meltdown zone felt like breaching the surface after a deep dive in toxic waters. The Geiger counters beeped less frantically, and the air, while still stiflingly hot, no longer hummed with the same oppressive radiation. The convoy slowed onto a lonely stretch of highway that once carried tourists to scenic vistas. Now the only scenery was an endless expanse of salt flats, jagged rock formations, and swirling columns of dust. They parked to assess their damage, armor plating pockmarked by fractal spikes, engines rattling from stress and radiation, troopers bruised, some bleeding, all exhausted. Lyra winced as a medic tended to her arm, applying an antiseptic foam that hissed on contact. Micah helped Kai down from the truck, where the boy seemed dazed, cheeks flushed. "He used some kind of ability," Lyra explained softly, wincing at the pain in her arm. "A raw projection of will, I suppose. But it drains him." "Mom, are we close?" Kai asked, voice trembling. Lyra's eyes flicked to Micah. He squinted at a battered, half-scorched sign that read, Death Valley National Park, 12 miles. We're close, Micah said quietly, ruffling the boy's hair in an uncharacteristic show of affection. Part of him marveled at how natural it felt to give comfort, despite the apocalyptic circumstances swirling around them. Colonel Reyes gathered everyone for a brief meeting. Dark circles underscored her eyes, but her posture remained rigid. We can't linger. The meltdown zone is behind us. But if Xanthus wants to push through, it will find a way. The vault you're seeking, she glanced at Lyra and Kai, then at Micah. You sure it's around here? Lyra nodded. It's hidden in a depression, partially underground. Seraph scouts found signs of it long ago, but we never managed to open it fully. Kai's unique genetics might be the key. If we can activate the vault's main power, the spectral corruption can be repelled across a wide radius, or at least contained. Reyes exhaled, scanning the ragtag group of survivors. They'd started with nearly 30. Now only 22 remained, some limping, some bandaged, but all resolved to see this through. We'll push on. Expect no easy path. Xanthus will be waiting. Once we're inside the vault, I assume you have some plan for these so-called reality stabilizers? Micah answered, from what Lyra told me, there's an ancient AI or system that can generate a field making the fabric of reality inhospitable to spectrals. But it's not just a flip of a switch, it requires a living interface. His gaze lingered on Kai. The notion of putting the boy at risk churned his stomach, yet there was no alternative. Kai alone could open that door. Reyes studied the child with an unreadable expression, part compassion, part resignation. You'd better be right, Dorn, she said. Otherwise, this was all for nothing. They climbed back into the convoy, weariness tugging at their eyes. The final leg of the journey stretched before them. A sense of foreboding clung to the air. After everything, no one believed Xanthus would let them waltz into the vault uncontested. The spectral entity had proven resourceful, relentless, and far-reaching. And then there was the question Micah tried not to dwell on. If they did open the vault, would the ancient power within truly choose to help them? He glanced at Lyra, who was nodding off in the seat behind him, bandaged arm resting across her lap. Next to her, Kai stared at the passing terrain with a mix of exhaustion and guarded hope. Micah's own thoughts drifted to regrets and lost battles, to the bunker he'd abandoned, to the moment he stepped back into the war he'd sworn off. Now there was no turning back. The truck rumbled onward, forging deeper into the heart of Death Valley, where an ancient secret waited to decide the fate of two species, and perhaps all of reality itself. The convoy pressed into Death Valley under a broiling sun, forging deeper into lands marred by unnatural forces. The splintered highway soon dissolved into shifting sand, forcing them onto a winding route near the ancient salt flats. Here, no road signs remained to guide them, only the towering rock formations to either side, bleached as pale as bone. Colonel Aria Reyes, riding with Micah Dorn in the lead truck, kept scanning for any sign of ambush. The encounter in the meltdown zone had proven that Xanthus was never far behind, even if it had yet to manifest in full force. Now the air felt uneasy, charged with tension. Reports crackled across the radio. Minimal sightings. Some troopers claimed to see flickers of crystalline outlines on the ridges, but the shapes vanished almost instantly. It was as if the spectrals were content to watch from a distance for the time being. Micah suspected that Xanthus was hurting them, orchestrating a final confrontation at the vault. Any radiation spikes? He asked, his voice rasping from dehydration and strain. Reyes shook her head, glancing at a flickering instrument panel. Nothing beyond baseline. This area is oddly stable, considering everything else. Could be the vault's influence. She sounded uncertain, though a faint spark of hope laced her words. Just before noon, they reached a jagged canyon that opened into a broad, sunken basin. From a higher vantage point, the area appeared like a crater, ringed by broken hills. In the center stood an edifice partway buried beneath dust and rubble, its surface glinting with strange angles. Lyra's voice came over the comm. That must be the vault. The entrance is partially collapsed, but I see the markings my people left behind. She sounded both relieved and uneasy. It's larger than I recall. Micah guided the truck down a narrow slope that spiraled into the basin. A hush fell over the convoy. This was the place where everything would be decided. At the base, the vehicles stopped in a rough semicircle, engines idling. Several troopers jumped out, fanning to secure a perimeter. The vault rose from the ground like a geometric puzzle, its bulk riddled with odd protrusions of etched metal. Its architecture defied easy description. Part spaceship, part temple, and part machine, all seamlessly fused. The surfaces shimmered whenever the sunlight struck them at certain angles. Some sections looked older than recorded history, while others appeared eerily modern, as if newly minted. A faint hum, too low to register consciously, thrummed at the edges of awareness. Lyra and Kai emerged from their truck, stepping gingerly onto the cracked earth. The child gazed at the structure with wistful, awestruck eyes. Micah, noticing, placed a steadying hand on Kai's shoulder. "You doing all right, kid?" The boy nodded, though he trembled ever so slightly. "I can feel it. It's singing, kind of like the spectrals, but different. More gentle, more..." He trailed off, struggling to articulate the impression. Lyra exchanged a look with Micah, her features a mixture of maternal concern and unwavering resolve. Then she gently drew Kai forward. Colonel Reyes approached, sidearm ready at her hip. Behind her, a half-dozen militia fighters formed a protective ring, scanning for trouble. "So how do we get in?" she asked curtly, eyeing the vault's external panels. Thick drifts of dust obscured what might have once been a doorway. "If we start blasting away the debris, we could bring half the structure down." Lyra stepped closer to the vault's weathered exterior. Luminescent markings flickered beneath her green skin, responding to some resonance from the structure. "Let me try," she said, pressing one palm to the metal. Kai mimicked the gesture, his smaller hand fitting into a faintly glowing imprint. A ring of symbols lit up, spiraling outward. The group watched in tense silence. The vault responded to their touch with subtle pulses, arcs of light traveling across the surface like living circuitry. A muffled grinding noise echoed from within, as if ancient mechanisms were stirring from eons of slumber. Lyra bit her lip, focusing. Then, with a jarring screech, a fissure formed in the vault's facade. Panels retracted, revealing a tall, wedge-shaped entrance. A warm glow, reminiscent of old tungsten bulbs, yet more organic, poured out. "We're in," Lyra said, stepping back. Her voice shook with anticipation. "Now we have to see if the vault truly welcomes us, or if we've just triggered an alarm for Xanthus to exploit." Micah exhaled slowly. The moment felt surreal, like stepping onto forbidden ground. He scanned the horizon one last time. No sign of overt, spectral assault. Yet he felt a prickle on his nape, as if watchful eyes pressed against them from unseen vantage points. "All right," he said, voice firm. "We go in small teams. Reyes, you coordinate defenses out here. If we don't come back, or if something tries to come out that's not us, you seal the entrance." The colonel nodded grimly. She clasped Micah's forearm, a silent gesture of camaraderie. "Good luck," she whispered. Then he, Lyra, Kai, and 3 troopers edged forward, stepping into the vault's luminous interior. Inside was a study in contrasts. Dust-coated floors met smooth, seamless corridors that glowed with hidden light sources. The temperature dropped noticeably. The air felt purified, as though the vault's internal systems still functioned after countless years. Intricate patterns spiraled along the walls, each line pulsing in different hues. Lyra's gaze danced over these patterns as though she could read them. Seraph explorers once theorized these lines were instructions or data pathways, she murmured, but no one ever deciphered them fully. Micah led the way, rifle at the ready, though the vault's hush made him feel oddly self-conscious. Each footstep echoed, magnified in the emptiness. The 3 troopers fanned out, scanning for threats in a careful leapfrog pattern. Kai stuck close to Lyra, eyes darting between the glowing lines and the dark recesses branching off the main corridor. He paused before an arched threshold on the left, brow furrowed. "It's through here," he said simply. "Something huge. It wants us to follow." One trooper snorted quietly, fingers twitching on the trigger. "That's exactly what a trap would feel like, kid." Lyra shot him a cool glance but said nothing. Instead, she placed a hand on the arch's surface. The panel lit up, swirling with pale blue patterns that parted like a mechanized iris. A gentle current of air brushed past them, stirred from deeper within. "We came for answers," Micah said, taking a breath. "Let's move." They entered a vast chamber that dwarfed their expectations. The ceiling soared high above, lost in swirling layers of faintly phosphorescent mist. Spread around the perimeter stood towering structures, perhaps columns or consoles, each shaped with an alien aesthetic. A central platform rose from the floor like a dais, covered in hexagonal tiles that glowed softly underfoot. The tiles reminded Micah of stepping stones, arranged in a broad circle. As soon as the group approached, the entire platform brightened. Overhead, lines of light converged, forming a skeletal dome of energy. A faint reverberation, like a distant hum, settled into their bones. "Is it alive?" one trooper whispered. Indeed, the place emanated a presence that bordered on sentient. Lyra pressed her lips together. The vault is said to house an ancient caretaker, an intelligence created by the predecessors. Her eyes flicked to Kai. The boy returned her gaze, then slowly stepped on to the central platform. Micah followed right beside him, scanning for any sign of immediate threat. Dust motes drifted in the otherwise still air, dancing in the beams of light. The moment Kai reached the center, a ring of glyphs materialized around him, rotating in midair. The luminous patterns played across his features, making them appear half human, half otherworldly. Micah felt a tremor of unease and awe in equal measure. Lyra joined her son, kneeling so they were at eye level. "Whatever you sense, you're not alone," she whispered. "I'll guide you as best I can. Let the vault see your intentions." Kai nodded, swallowing hard. He reached out both hands, threads of light extended from the dais, wrapping around his arms and chest like shining vines. For an instant, Micah nearly lunged, afraid the vault might be ensnaring him. But Lyra placed a calming hand on Micah's shoulder. "Wait," she murmured. "This is how it communicates." An intangible pressure filled the air, like static before a lightning strike. Suddenly, a voice reverberated through the chamber, not audible in the usual sense, but resonating in their minds. Identity verification, anomalies detected, cross-species genetic traits, clearance, provisionally granted. The voice sounded neutral, layered, ancient. A swirl of shapes appeared overhead. Holographic projections of star systems, planetary grids, lines of data. The troopers exchanged uneasy glances, gripping their weapons tighter. They too must have heard it telepathically. Lyra's eyes widened in recognition. "The caretaker AI," she breathed. "It's scanning us." A barrage of images flashed across the swirling projections. Earth's continents, fractal expansions, glimpses of seraph homeworlds, and dreadful scenes of cosmic devastation. Kai shuddered as if absorbing centuries of knowledge at once. "We need your help," he managed to speak, voice quivering. "The spectrals are rewriting everything. We want to stop them." The caretaker's presence deepened in their minds, like an immense consciousness turning its attention fully upon them. Threat recognized. Entity classified as spectrals. Designation: reality warping parasites. Current timeline: extensive damage. Primary function: protection and maintenance of localized reality nodes. The vault's lights flared, and a swirling map of Earth took center stage, dotted with ragged red zones. Those must represent spectral strongholds. Micah's pulse quickened. "Then you know how to drive them back?" he asked aloud. For a moment, there was only the hum of energy. Then the voice replied, "Yes, with a stabilization matrix, but it requires a living interface of hybrid capability." All eyes fell on Kai, the caretaker's mental signature focused, like a spotlight shining on the boy's genetic essence. "The child possesses the necessary binding sequences. Prepare for convergence." Lyra's face paled. "Convergence? That wasn't... He's only a child." But the caretaker's resolve felt implacable. There is no other path. The spectrals seek perfection at the cost of all life. Reality must be defended. Light beams swelled around Kai, who looked torn between awe and terror. Micah's breath caught. He understood the vault's logic. Merging with Kai's unique DNA might create the ultimate barrier to repel Xanthus. But at what cost to the boy? Outside, Colonel Reyes and the remaining militia formed defensive positions, scanning the horizon for trouble. The vault's newly opened entrance loomed behind them. Occasionally, flickers of light from within spilled across the dust, hinting that something monumental transpired in the depths. Yet no word had come from Micah or the others. Anxiety gnawed at Reyes. They were vulnerable out here. If Xanthus decided to strike, it could corner them against the vault's walls. A crackle of static burst in Reyes's earpiece. Patrol 1 here. Movement to the east. Might be illusions, but we see shapes. Her stomach twisted, recalling the meltdown zone ambush. Stay sharp, she ordered. If they're illusions, they're meant to distract or probe. Don't engage unless necessary. The trooper acknowledged, tension evident in his voice. Clouds of dust kicked up along the ridges, forming swirling patterns like beckoning hands. Overhead, the sky shimmered in places, fractal geometry faintly visible. Was that Xanthus shaping the very atmosphere? Reyes paced around the perimeter, counting troopers, assessing their weaponry. She paused at a newly set guard post, a makeshift barricade of sandbags and scavenged metal. Morales, any sign of a direct approach? She asked the soldier perched behind a stationary laser cannon. He shook his head, gaze pinned on the swirling dust. Not yet, Colonel, but it feels wrong, like something's coiling to strike. She understood that feeling too well. The hush of a calm before the storm. She recalled White Sands, how the spectrals expanded in slow, creeping tendrils, then erupted all at once, rewriting everything. Her knuckles whitened around the grip of her sidearm. She wouldn't let that happen again if there was any chance of stopping it. Moments later, the dust parted, revealing half a dozen crystalline thralls, silent and graceful. They seemed to waver as they advanced, as if phasing in from another dimension. Reyes inhaled sharply. Positions! The trooper snapped to readiness, weapons locking onto the intruders. Over the radio, Reyes barked, "We have contact. Eastern perimeter. Engaging." The thralls spread out, reflective surfaces scattering the sunlight in shards of brilliance. Reyes swore under her breath. Xanthus was testing them again. The militia opened fire. Bullets pinged off crystal limbs, plasma bursts melted fractal edges. 2 thralls shattered under the barrage, but the others moved with inhuman agility. Before Reyes could issue another command, the thralls shifted, merging their forms. In seconds, they coalesced into a single entity nearly 10 feet tall, spiked with crackling arcs of energy. "Target that fusion!" Reyes shouted. A volley of grenades whooshed out, detonating in bright flashes. The monstrous shape reeled, fractal plating cracking. Dust billowed in thick clouds, stinging the trooper's eyes. When the dust settled, the fused thrall had broken apart into smaller shapes that skittered away, reconfiguring. The militia pressed forward, not allowing them to regroup. Laser cannon blasts scored direct hits, turning one thrall into splinters. Still more spectral illusions wavered on the ridges, suggesting additional threats waiting to manifest. Reyes ground her teeth. They might be pinned here, fending off wave after wave, while Micah's team battled for the vault's secrets underground. If the caretaker's plan failed, they wouldn't just lose the day, they'd lose the world. A sudden distortion wavered in the very center of the basin, forming a vortex of fractal geometry that glowed with unearthly intensity. Reyes felt the hair on her arms stand on end. This presence was bigger, more concentrated than any mere thrall. She realized with dawning horror that Xanthus might be coming through in a partial avatar. "Pull back to the vault entrance," she yelled. Heart pounding, the troopers obeyed, dragging the wounded, forming a defensive ring near the doors. Over the howling wind, Reyes stared at the crystallizing vortex. A humanoid shape started to coalesce, towering and prismatic. It spoke in a voice that resonated from ground to sky. The end of imperfection is nigh. Deep within the vault's central chamber, Kai trembled at the caretaker's pronouncement of convergence. Micah Dorn felt his stomach knot. A swirl of holographic geometry surrounded the boy, each line brimming with potential energy. Lyra hovered protectively at Kai's side, her wounded arms still clutched to her chest. The caretaker's presence pressed upon them all, ancient and inexorable. The spectrals propagate false perfection. Without immediate stabilization, this world will fall. Its telepathic voice left no room for negotiation. "What does convergence entail?" Micah demanded, stepping forward. "We need to know if this is going to—" He struggled to say the word harm, but couldn't. "Hurt him." A swirl of new imagery appeared overhead, showing a stylized depiction of a child melding with a luminous core, streams of data funneling through him. The caretaker's reply radiated calm certainty. The interface will draw on the child's unique genetic code and psychic potential. Risk is statistically acceptable for the greater outcome. Micah's anger flared. Risk? He's not some data node you can reformat. The caretaker's luminous lines flickered, echoing a faint echo of perplexion. This is the only path. The convergence has been foretold in design protocols. Without it, reality will succumb to the spectral's unchecked expansion. Lyra's expression twisted in conflict. She glanced at her son, who gazed back with eyes that shimmered with tears. Mom, Kai whispered, voice shaking. I want to help. If I don't, they'll destroy us. Tension crackled like static. The three troopers who accompanied them stood on the dais' perimeter, weapons useless against intangible philosophies. Lyra closed her eyes, wrestling with a primal fear. When she opened them, emerald light flared through the luminescent patterns in her skin. Caretaker, she said, voice trembling yet firm, if there is any chance that convergence kills him, then I refuse, no matter how dire our situation. We won't sacrifice children. A swirling hush filled the chamber. The caretaker seemed to weigh her words. A memory buffer of unknown eons churned. Then gradually, the AI's aura shifted, tinted with a hint of compassion. Harm to the interface is not our objective. If the process completes successfully, the child will emerge strengthened, joined with stabilization energies. It paused, lines of code rippling in the air. He will carry the burden of keeping reality in balance. Lyra's shoulders sagged, relief mingling with continued fear. A burden, she echoed softly. Kai, do you understand? The boy's eyes gleamed with tears, but his jaw set in determination. Yes, I feel it calling me. I can do this if it means stopping them. Stopping Xanthus. Micah exhaled, heart heavy. He crouched beside Kai, placing a firm hand on the child's shoulder. Kid, you're braver than any soldier I've met, but you don't have to do this alone. Kai nodded, wiping at his face. I know, I can feel you all with me. Lyra gathered him in a brief, fierce hug, pressing her forehead to his. You're my world, she whispered. Never forget that. She stepped back, letting him stand at the center of the dais, where the swirling lights intensified. The caretaker's presence swelled, initiating stabilization bond. Runes along the floor brightened, and pillars around the chamber hummed in harmony. Kai lifted his arms, leaning his head back as if surrendering to a warm tide. Light poured around him, threads weaving into his very silhouette. Lyra gasped, tears sliding down her cheeks despite her stoic attempt to remain calm. Micah felt a lump in his throat as he watched the child become enveloped by luminous filaments. The caretaker's voice resonated, calmer now. Focus, anchor yourself within the human heart and seraph mind. Merge them. The boy's face contorted in concentration. Then he let out a sharp gasp. Flashes of memory, or maybe visions, danced across the air. Glimpses of a million possible futures. Worlds consumed by fractal expansions. Timelines annihilated. Through it all, Kai's slender frame glowed with an otherworldly radiance, as if becoming a conduit for the vault's deepest power. Micah felt the floor tremble beneath him. Reality itself seemed to shift, aligning to a new axis. The caretaker's illusions or data projections shimmered, showing Earth on a cosmic scale. Crystalline spires retreated in some images, dissolving into motes of light. Meanwhile, outside the vault, a fierce confrontation raged. Micah caught flickers of Colonel Reyes's defensive lines, fractals swirling in the desert air. This was more than a vision. It was a real-time map of events. He clenched his fists, praying they wouldn't be too late. Outside, Colonel Reyes faced the towering avatar of Xanthus. Over 20 feet tall, the being radiated fractal perfection, each limb encased in glowing prismatic plates. Smaller thralls converged around it, forming a protective lattice that hummed with destructive potential. The militia fired relentlessly, but their shots either ricocheted or were absorbed by the shifting geometry. Xanthus's crystalline visage turned toward the vault entrance, voice echoing across the basin. Surrender the child. The age of evolution cannot be halted. Rhea spat dust, heart pounding. Fall back inside, she called to her troops. We use the bottleneck to keep them from overwhelming us. The troopers scrambled into a fortified position near the vault doorway, an impromptu fortress of sandbags, broken vehicles, and shield projectors. In the sky above, fractal distortions swirled like storm clouds, warping the sunlight into bizarre colors. The temperature felt oppressive. "Reyes," coughed one soldier, pressing a bloodied rag to a shrapnel wound on his thigh. "Are we done for?" The colonel refused to surrender to despair. "Not while we can still fight," she hissed. "We hold them as long as it takes for Dorn's team to do whatever they're doing in there." Even as she spoke, she saw thralls shifting their approach, fanning out along the rocky ridges to encircle the vault. So far, they hadn't forced a direct assault on the doors, likely because Xanthus wanted Kai intact. But the sense of impending doom thickened. One thrall advanced too close, and a trooper nailed it with a well-placed plasma grenade. The explosion tore the creature to shards. For a brief moment, Reyes felt a stab of triumph. Then two more thralls replaced it, emerging from the swirling dust. She realized this was an endless cycle. Each time they inflicted damage, Xanthus regenerated or reabsorbed its minions. Her eyes flicked to the colossal avatar, which surveyed the battlefield like a dispassionate god. The swirling fractal patterns on its surface formed new shapes, symbols reminiscent of mathematics and cosmic geometry. From the vault interior, a surge of bright light flared. Reyes shielded her eyes. The troopers, too, glanced back in surprise. At that exact moment, the avatar of Xanthus stiffened. Its head twitched as if it sensed a powerful disturbance. "Impossible," it rumbled, the crystal facets scraping together like tectonic plates. A ripple of uncertainty ran through the thralls. Some froze mid-march, their heads angled in silent query. That was all the opening Reyes needed. "Now!" she shouted, and the militia unleashed a coordinated barrage. Plasma mortars thumped. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked overhead. Explosions rippled across the thrall ranks, fracturing their defenses. A few troopers cheered as the monstrous shapes collapsed into glittering fragments. But Reyes remained grimly focused. She knew Xanthus's real power lay in intangible manipulation of reality. The avatar might reconstitute itself at any moment. Inside the vault, a sudden wave of trembling radiated outward. The doors glowed with dancing lines. Then a beam of pure luminescence shot skyward from the vault's roof, slicing into the fractal-streaked heavens like a sword of light. Reyes and her troops gaped, momentarily stunned by the brilliance. The fractal storms overhead quivered, forming bizarre kaleidoscopic patterns. And just like that, Xanthus's avatar let out a roar of fury. "No!" it bellowed, voice cracking with a resonant, subharmonic wail that made the ground quake. Its towering form lurched, fractal surfaces rippling as though suddenly destabilized from within. Reyes's radio crackled. "Colonel, the vault! Some kind of energy spike! Our instruments are going haywire!" She nodded sharply, adrenaline surging. "Let it go haywire if it tears them apart. Keep firing." The thralls nearest the vault tried to rally, but their movements stuttered, geometry failing to reassemble with its customary grace. Something within the valley's environment had shifted, as though the air itself rebelled against spectral incursion. Reyes caught sight of the massive avatar trembling, shards flaking off its crystalline hide. She allowed herself a grim smile. Maybe the caretaker's legendary defenses were no myth after all. Within the vault's central chamber, the transformation reached its crescendo. Kai floated a few inches off the ground, limbs splayed as luminous streams of data coursed through his aura. The caretaker's voice resonated across them all, a low thrumming command. Stabilization phase engaged, anchoring to hybrid union genetic source, proceeding with reality reinforcement. Micah, Lyra, and the three troopers could only watch in a mixture of awe and terror. The swirling runes around Kai cascaded through the air like waterfalls of light. "Hang on, kid," Micah whispered, fists clenched at his sides. Through the shifting glow, he caught glimpses of Kai's face, pinched with concentration, determined, yet also brimming with a strange calm. The boy's eyes glowed with a brilliance akin to the caretaker's panels, as if he was reading entire libraries of knowledge in seconds. The floor trembled. Outside the dais, pillars flared one by one. Patterns skittered along the vault walls, streaming into an overhead nexus that seemed to expand and contract like a breathing organism. Lyra's tears glistened as she watched. He, he's doing it. I can feel his spirit, like an open channel. He's connecting the caretaker's system with humanity's raw will to survive, with the seraph gift to shape energies. She pressed a trembling hand to her own chest, feeling the radiant hum that pulsed in her bones. A keening noise split the air. Kai's back arched, and for a horrifying moment, Micah feared he was in agony. Then the boy's posture eased, replaced by a new steadiness. His feet touched the dais. A sphere of light coalesced above him, shimmering with fractal outlines that snapped in and out of existence. Frequency sync achieved, intoned the caretaker. Reality lock initiated. ETA for full dispersion, 30 seconds. Panels in the walls parted, revealing control consoles that flared with alien glyphs. Streams of raw energy shot upward, spiraling through the overhead columns. Micah felt the hair on his arms rise. The caretaker's system was building to some unstoppable surge. "We need to get ready," he said through clenched teeth, stepping toward Kai. Lyra, too, moved closer, though arcs of residual energy crackled against her presence. The caretaker wasn't shutting them out exactly, but it was clear it needed Kai free from distraction. Then, as if triggered by the vault's rising power, the chamber darkened at the edges. Micah glanced around, alarmed. Shadows formed into fractal shapes, coalescing into a half-human figure of glittering crystal. "Xanthus," he spat, raising his rifle. It appeared that even from outside, the entity had reached a long, insidious hand into the vault. "Your efforts are admirable," the intruder said in that layered, resonant voice that made bones ache. "But you cannot resist the future. The child belongs to the new shape of reality." Lyra hissed, summoning a swirl of green light around her injured arm. She flung a bolt at the crystalline apparition. It passed through, scattering some shards, but Xanthus reformed almost instantly. The caretaker's voice throbbed. "Vault security compromised." On the dais, Kai's glow faltered, flickers of confusion crossing his face. Micah cursed under his breath. They were so close to sealing reality, but Xanthus had intruded at the final moment. One of the troopers launched a short-range plasma rocket. It streaked across the chamber, detonating near the spectral projection. The explosion shredded a portion of its form, forcing it to recoil. "Keep hitting it," Micah bellowed. The second and third troopers fired in tandem, their blast causing fractal segments to peel away. For a moment, it seemed the assault might eradicate the projection. But the entity's edges glowed again, weaving back together with unstoppable fluidity. "We have to buy Kai time to complete the bond," Lyra urged, voice trembling with urgency. She limped forward, summoning more crackling arcs despite her obvious fatigue. Micah joined, firing his rifle into the shifting mass. Shot after shot hammered the projection, fracturing it. Each time, though, it refused to disperse entirely. Xanthus's voice reverberated, mocking and cold. "Your weaponry is based on archaic matter. We are beyond it." Micah was about to retort when a pulse of radiant light surged from Kai. The dais glowed with renewed force, beams lancing upward. "Reality lock at 80%, announced the caretaker. 15 seconds remain. Xanthus let out a snarl, twisting its projection into a razor-limbed shape. It lunged toward Kai, determined to disrupt the final integration. "Not on my watch," Micah roared. He dove forward, slamming into the spectral form with a desperate tackle. For an instant, it felt like tackling jagged ice, shards ripping at his arms. But he held firm, letting the troopers bombard the mass with plasma bursts. Lyra added her energy in a final frantic surge. Electricity snapped across Xanthus's shimmering body, prying it apart. The caretaker's voice deepened, reality lock commencing. Kai opened his eyes, which now shone a fierce gold. He raised both hands. The swirling sphere overhead crackled, then unleashed a dome of pure white light that expanded outward, filling the entire chamber. Xanthus's projection shrieked, fractal geometry unraveling. The body convulsed, torn into shards that the caretaker's field promptly dissolved. Streams of luminous dust scattered, then vanished completely. Micah, flung aside by the shockwave, tumbled across the floor. Ears ringing, he looked up to see Kai standing in the center of the dais, wreathed in a halo of light. The caretaker's presence whispered, "Stabilization complete." Outside, as the dome of light flared through the vault's structure, Colonel Reyes and her troopers witnessed a dazzling phenomenon. The swirling fractal shapes in the sky flickered wildly, then collapsed upon themselves. Xanthus's towering avatar froze mid-lunge, crystalline limbs spasming. A roar of indignation rolled through the valley. Its smaller thralls, caught in the same upheaval, shattered like brittle glass. For the first time since the spectrals emerged on Earth, they looked truly vulnerable, uncertain, undone by a power greater than their own. Reyes gave a fierce grin. "Hit them with everything." The militia poured fire into the wavering avatar. Without the solidity of its fractal anchor, the behemoth broke apart. Shards of crystal clattered onto the dust, then dissolved into motes of pale luminescence. All around them, thralls collapsed, warping back into the silhouettes of once human hosts. Some might be beyond saving. Others, though, flickered with a brief sign of returning humanity before the caretaker's stabilizing wave finished unraveling the spectral corruption. The shining column from the vault's roof intensified, then swept across the entire basin in a wave of brilliance. Suddenly, the fractal distortions overhead vanished, replaced by the stark, cloudless desert sky. The ground beneath their feet stilled, as if exhaling a long-held breath. Reyes felt tears burn her eyes. She couldn't explain the sensation, but it was as if the world itself had been set back onto its rightful axis. The radio buzzed with astonished voices. "It's collapsing! They're gone!" Inside the vault, Micah Dorn and Lyra approached Kai. The boy stood there, his aura dimming from blinding brilliance to a soft glow. When they finally reached him, he half smiled. "Mom, Mr. Dorn, we did it," he whispered, voice shaky with exhaustion. Lyra wrapped him in a trembling embrace, pressing her cheek to his hair. "Yes, my brave child. Yes, we did." Micah felt relief flood his entire being, along with renewed respect for Kai's courage. The caretaker's calm, measured voice chimed overhead. Reality stabilized within primary sector. Spectral imprint purged. Infected hosts undergoing possible restoration. A swirl of images passed through the chamber, showing other continents and pockets of fractal corruption collapsing. The caretaker addressed Kai directly. "Your bond is complete. Though our active nodes will continue work, you remain the living key. Your will may guide our resources in times of need." The words were both a blessing and a solemn duty. Kai nodded, blinking away tears. They emerged from the vault to find Reyes and the militia picking through the aftermath of the short but intense confrontation. Broken shards of crystal disintegrated into harmless dust, drifting away on the desert wind. A few half-transformed thralls lay unmoving, uncertain whether they might revert to fully human or remain in limbo. Medics rushed in, checking vital signs. Some revived with groggy confusion, blinking at the harsh sunlight as though awakened from a nightmare. Others had succumbed to the final throes of spectral corruption, their bodies too far gone. Rhea strode over, face smeared with dust and sweat. Her voice trembled with quiet amazement. "Dorn, Lyra, Kai." She didn't finish the sentence, just embraced Micah in a soldier's grip, then rested a hand on Kai's shoulder. "We saw the energy wave. Whatever you did in there, it worked." Lyra looked up at the merciless sun, then down at her child. "Not just me," she said softly. "Kai bridged the gap between caretaker and mortal hearts. We all did, and in our own ways." In the days that followed, reports trickled in from outlying regions. The wave of stabilization that began at the vault spread through hidden lines of ancient technology, purging spectral corruption at its source. Some regions needed additional help, requiring crews to restore local nodes or rely on Kai's newly awakened connection. But the unstoppable expansion of fractal horrors had halted. Humanity and the Seraph people, battered and exhausted, slowly dared to hope. Months later, a new settlement rose around the Death Valley Vault. Freed of spectral threats, the desert's stark beauty returned, surprising many with how quickly life could rebound. The caretaker's systems, guided by Kai's gentle presence, became a cornerstone of renewal, providing pockets of stabilized reality, vital farmland where none had existed, and technology that blended Seraph and human ingenuity. Colonel Reyes headed a coalition of former militia, newly awakened survivors, and Seraph envoys who cooperated to rebuild shattered infrastructures. Micah Dorn found himself unexpectedly central to this emerging era. He stood on a bluff overlooking the settlement, watching as caravans arrived daily, humans and seraphs alike. The caretaker's influence promised protection, and word had spread. Lyra approached from behind, her healing arm no longer bandaged, a graceful efficiency in each step. Kai ran ahead, greeting newcomers who looked both astonished and relieved to see a child with such quiet confidence. Still surprises me, Micah murmured as Lyra joined him, that after all that's happened, we stand here without fear of crystals tearing apart the horizon. The emerald glow in Lyra's cheeks deepened as she nodded. We owe it to him, she said, gesturing toward Kai, who laughed with a group of wide-eyed children, some human, some seraph hybrids. And to you, Micah Dorn, you never gave up, even when the world gave you every reason to hide. He turned, meeting her gaze, and a warmth flooded his chest that had nothing to do with the desert sun. Their bond, forged in crisis, had blossomed into a closeness neither had anticipated. Gently, Lyra placed her hand over his. We all bear scars, she said softly, but now we have the chance to heal them together. Micah squeezed her hand, feeling the future open up like the desert sky, vast and full of possibilities. Below them, new structures rose in the distance, metal frames glinting in the light of a midday sun. Past the settlement's edges, desert flora reasserted itself, small green shoots that hinted life would always find a way. The vault's towering entrance remained a constant reminder, an ancient guardianship that, for countless years, had awaited just the right spark of hope. In the end, no one could say how many of the purged thralls returned fully to themselves, nor how many enclaves of spectral distortion might still lurk in distant corners. But the caretaker's presence assured them they had the tools to face any lingering threat. And with each day, more souls ventured out of bunkers and hidden camps, reclaiming the world from the crystalline nightmares that once claimed so many lives. Dad, came a shout, bright and clear as day. Kai stood perched on a rocky outcrop, waving enthusiastically. That single word, spoken so naturally, tugged on Micah's heart. He smiled, answering with a wave of his own. Beside him, Lyra watched with tears shimmering in her golden eyes. A new family, born out of conflict. A new world shaped by cooperation and resilience. And above, the sun continued its age-old journey across a sky free of fractal horrors, a reminder that life moves forward with or without permission. Yet this time, humanity and the seraphs would move forward together, forging a tomorrow where the impossible had already been conquered, and hope shone as the brightest star of all. As I look back on this journey, it's clear the triumph we witnessed was more than just a victory over the spectrals. It was a testament to unity, compassion, and the resilience born from struggle. We saw hardened soldiers learn to trust again, a frightened child find the strength to save two species, and people from different worlds setting aside mistrust to fight for a shared tomorrow. Obstacles that seemed impossible became stepping stones, reminding us that even in our darkest hour, hope can shine brightest. I'm personally moved by how these characters chose solidarity over fear. Their story reminds me that when we pool our gifts, protect the vulnerable, and dare to believe in each other, we're capable of rewriting our fate. Thank you for accompanying us on this epic ride. I invite you to share your thoughts, interpretations, and favorite moments in the comments. Let's discuss how such tales of courage and heart can inspire us to persevere in our own lives.